I love a lot of video game series, but the reality is that once a video game starts to go into decline, into perpetual decline, very rarely, if ever, do they ever return to their former self or their former form where they were a ton of fun. And I think there's countless examples of this, but there's many reasons why this is the case, beyond just the fact that the people that made those games are no longer there. And I think that a great example of this is the Final Fantasy series, where you have these games that had such huge amounts of magic to them, whether it was Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, but you started to see a change in the Final Fantasy series, especially around Final Fantasy X-2. I mean, there was Final Fantasy 11, a lot of people like that, but then things started to get a little bit rocky with 12, and then 13 happened, and a lot of people didn't like it, and then 15 had development hell, and 16 is very different than the old Final Fantasy games. But the thing is, a lot of the reasons why these series kind of enter perpetual decline or are not the same is because the people are gone. There's the people that made the video games what they were are no longer present at the company, whether it's the people that made the music, the programmers, the game directors, and ultimately these people make that experience what it is. And they make that experience that fun and innovative experience. And while you can kind of translate those ideas within the company and try to create a company culture to embody those ideas, ultimately the perspectives, the structure, the things that kind of went into the video game with those people and those artists is gone and it's no longer present. And even if you train people at the company, even if you kind of share some of that wisdom and insight or have that code, it's still just very hard to keep that going over time. But beyond the people is this financial component, which I think a lot of people miss, because over time, as a video game series gets popular, generally speaking, it earns more and more revenue and more profit. And generally too, a lot of these companies become publicly traded companies or are looking to become acquired. And what this ends up doing is it creates this incentive to continue to grow revenue, which makes sense, right? This is what every kind of business wants to do, but in particular, the publicly traded companies, where with every game in the series, there is this incentive to want to grow revenue and earnings more and more. You want to continue to grow sales with the next game in the series or with the next video game that you make. And ultimately, what ends up happening is you reach a point of saturation with a game. If you have a JRPG with a certain gameplay mechanic, or a certain art style, there is a saturation on how many people are wanting to play that video game. Or if you have a first-person shooter with a certain dynamic, it appeals to only so many people. Doesn't matter the genre, doesn't matter the game, there's a point of saturation. And inevitably what a lot of companies will do is they'll water down the gameplay mechanics. They'll try to make the game more mass appealable to get more sales. In a lot of ways, it makes sense. You want to increase the number of people that play the video game. In a lot of ways, the only way to do that is to water down gameplay mechanics, to make it more simple, to try to appeal to people in other genres. And of course, you can also do other things like try to add microtransactions or monetize customers even more, raise prices. And a lot of times what this ends up doing is you lose the core essence of the video game. The watering down of the gameplay mechanics, the making of the game to be more mass appealable or lowering the skill ceiling inevitably destroys the creative component of the video game. And the thing is, video games are inherently creative. There is a creative aspect, whether it's the music, the gameplay design, the storytelling, the art assets that go into this experience. There is a creative aspect that is hard to mitigate with kind of risk mitigation. And a lot of businesses, I think, want to mitigate that risk. And so what they end up doing is things that are safe. They make sequels, they don't innovate on new gameplay mechanics, they reuse a lot of code because it's costly to go and build new assets. But ultimately, that destroys the creative process. And because video games are very creative in of themselves, it hurts the quality of the video game. And so they kind of slowly start to decline in terms of their overall quality. There is this level of risk mitigation where you want to play it safe. You don't want to do a crazy story because maybe that's not as mass appealable versus having a story that's very straightforward. Or if you make a game too difficult or too crazy, you just alienate certain customers that would maybe not buy the game. Or if you make the game more complicated, it alienates some customers, especially when you're trying to make the game more mass appealable. That's a problem when they're wanting to continue to grow revenue. The other thing too is that you see this with RPGs where you water down RPG mechanics. You try to make it more of a action-based game with light RPG mechanics than a true proper RPG. And I think that this risk mitigation, like I said, lowers the quality of the video game in of itself. And there is, to some extent, a level of greed and short-termism with that, because if you keep making a high-quality video game, you focus on bringing value to the customer, ultimately, I think you build a very loyal customer base. You build a loyal audience, and people will continue to buy that product. And so it almost kind of acts as this kind of perpetual golden egg that continues to bring you revenue. but a lot of companies want to push it even further. They want to earn more revenue. They want to continue to see growth. And in a lot of ways, the short-termism is rewarded because of the incentives. People just want to advance their careers and then they leave, or they just want to extract as much revenue out of the game series, even though if they kept the quality going, they could have this kind of golden egg, this golden goose that continues to provide value into the long term. But I think there's this push towards short-termism, and this is kind of a thing that's affecting society more broadly than just video games that affects the quality of these video games. But the thing is too, it's also this changing political and social dynamic happening within society. You know, when you look at the Final Fantasy games like 7, 8, and 9, they were made in the 90s. And there was a certain cultural and political aspect to these video games and the way that they were created and the people that made these games that influenced them. And so you have this kind of creative aspect that is hard to replicate in the modern day. These games are a product of their time. This dynamic is hard to repeat. And there's also changing market dynamics. You have changing technology. You have, for example, the rise of social media. You have better gameplay and graphics. You have new market trends. You have societal changes, and this just kind of makes it hard to replicate that success over and over and over again. I think a good example of this is music genres, where you see music being very popular in certain time periods, whether it's classic rock or big band music or electronic music or metal music, where they had this kind of popularity for maybe 10 years, and then a new genre came in and took its place. Not to say that those genres of music aren't made anymore, but there was this period where that was the popular thing, where there was a certain way of doing things. And I think that's the same thing with video games. Remember, video games are inherently creative. They incorporate music, but there's also the art asset side, there's the storytelling. And I think this cultural and political dynamic also influences the quality of these games. And it's just very hard to keep that going over time. When you look at it, not many video game series have this resilience. I think the one example I can think of is Nintendo, where you see the longevity of Mario and Zelda and a lot of the Nintendo IPs that have maintained relevancy for a very long time. But if you look at other game series like Halo or even Call of Duty, which has started to decline, you kind of see this also with Assassin's Creed. It's just hard to keep that quality going. It's hard to keep that cultural relevancy over time. And like I said, there is this level of risk mitigation at these companies where I think that in a lot of ways, they want to mitigate the creative risk in the process. They want to earn more and more revenue and profit in the safest way possible. And that's why you see this increase in remakes and remasters, because a lot of the dynamics are already made. The music and the soundtrack has already been created. The story is already there. The core gameplay ideas are already there. And it's just a matter of improving the graphics, fixing some bugs, improving the sound effects or something like that. And you kind of get this safe return. And I think that you see this with so many sequels being made, so many remasters and remakes. But once again, it goes back to that creative aspect, that lack of creativity, which ultimately I think brings value to the customer. And this lack of innovation also kind of making the video games stale in of themselves. And so when you look at it, unfortunately, there's just so many game series, whether it's Dragon Age, Mass Effect, Elder Scrolls, Final Fantasy, Assassin's Creed, Command & Conquer, Dead Space, whatever you want to just put out there in terms of a video game series, so many of them have been in perpetual decline, or they're just not culturally relevant anymore. And I think that the thing is, a lot of these series actually could be relevant in the modern day. I don't necessarily think that some of them are a product of their time, even though they could be, but I think that they haven't been handled with care. There has been a focus on short-termism versus the long-term value that they can bring to the company. And I think that requires this level of long-term vision, which is just really not present within the video game industry in some respects. And of course, there's other dynamics that are affecting that. But I think that so many of these series have so much potential, but they just haven't been handled with care. And I think with the current state of the industry, none of these series are really probably ever coming back. There has just been this slow walk towards mediocrity and inevitable ultimate decline.